If you're into podcasts, you should check out our podcast, Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. It's about cold cases that were eventually solved. New episodes are released every other week. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. Number 3. The Hammersmith Ghost. George Jones swore he was stone cold sober, because that was the first question his employers and Coldstream guards had when they heard his report. Jones was a night watchman in the village of Hammersmith in southwest London. It was October 1804, long before any kind of recognized police force roamed the city. So the village paid Coldstream to send their guards around town just to keep an eye on the town's serpentine streets late at night. Perhaps George's boss said it was his imagination playing tricks on him. His response was definitive and unwavering. "I solemnly declare that I am ready at any time to make an oath to what I have stated," he said. "I believe I had seen a ghost." The sighting had come only a day earlier, when Jones said a young boy who was up far past his bedtime had raced up to him white as a sheet. The kid was terrified because he had seen a ghost. Slightly bemused, the watchman took the boy to where he had been and was shocked that he also saw an apparition approaching him out of the thick fog. Jones didn't mind admitting that he and the boy hustled away. That was probably best, because there were other sightings of the ghost in the area in the ensuing weeks, and the witnesses weren't as lucky to escape injury. One man, Thomas Groom, a house servant, told newspapers that after his shift ended late at night, he walked home past the churchyard and was attacked out of nowhere by a white-robed figure that choked and pulled him towards the church's cemetery. Another man, Mr. Cromwell, a store clerk, told the papers he was also accosted by a spectre, as was a local rat catcher while setting his nightly traps. It was after one particularly terrifying incident that people started to take notice of these apparent hauntings. One night, a young mother, pregnant with her second child, was returning home late from her job as a house servant. As she turned a corner to take a shortcut by the church, she spotted something out of the corner of her eye. Her account was recorded from her hospital bed soon after her ordeal. It said she had cuts and bruises on her arms from the attack. When she approached the graveyard alongside Black Lion Lane, she said something darted out at her, an apparition dressed all in white. Terrified, the woman turned to run, but instead fainted in fear, falling hard onto the cobblestone street. Later, in hospital, she unfortunately miscarried. 2 days later, a hemorrhage from her miscarriage took her life as well. For its part, the Georgian-era press ate this up. They wrote more sensational stories about other people's encounters with the Hammersmith Ghost. There was an account of Mr. Russell, a horse-drawn carriage driver. While driving a cab full of passengers, he was startled by a white apparition that darted into the road in front of his horses on Black Lion Lane. When it wailed and moaned into the night, the horses reared up. Mr. Russell leapt from his hansom cab and watched helplessly as the horses ran off, still hauling the terrified passengers. There were other, braver souls who saw the ghost and tried to follow it, only to discover it had the ability to glide through stone walls when pursued and cornered. The paper speculated that the spirit might be that of an unnamed man who died by suicide by slitting his own throat in Black Lion Lane a year earlier. But there were those who didn't care who the ghost was, only that it needed to be dealt with. Unconvinced that the Coldstream Company's stable of guards could patrol all of Hammersmith, a few local men decided to take up the job themselves. One of those men was 29-year-old Francis Smith. On a January Tuesday in 1805, Francis was tipping a few at the White Hart public house with a few pals when the topic of the local ghost came up. Francis grew determined to expose the so-called spirit, and the group hatched a plan to patrol the streets that very night. After last call, Francis went back to his rooming house and picked up his loaded rifle. His mates had promised to do the same, so they devised a code word in order to recognize each other in the town's notoriously thick fog. Later, while sulking about Black Lion Lane, Francis saw a white apparition in the fog coming towards him. He shouted his code word, but got no response. "Damn you," he yelled. "Who are you?" When no one answered, Francis fired. A groan followed, and the distinctive sound of a crumpling body. Francis ran up to the white figure lying in the street, proudly calling out that he had shot the ghost. But at his feet, there was no ghost. It was 23-year-old Thomas Millwood, who was heading off to work as a plasterer, dressed all in white, as plasterers did back then. As Millwood lay bleeding on the cobblestone, blood staining his white overalls from a bullet to the jaw, Francis Smith's buddies arrived, horrified by what they saw. Later, a court sentenced Smith to 1 year in Newgate Prison for what it called willful murder. Smith protested that it was an accident. However, the judge pointed out they had gone out into the street with his gun, looking to kill, ghost or no ghost. The press had a field day with the story of Smith's murder of Tom Millwood. And whether he meant to do it or not, the shooting had at least one interesting outcome. After it, there were no more reports of ghosts on Black Lion Lane or around Hammersmith, at least for a while. In the 1830s came further reports of a suspicious apparition around town. Multiple women out walking at night said that they were being attacked by a white-clad figure and had to suffer cuts to their faces and arms. Then, in 1905, Hammersmith papers reported ghostly sightings of a white-robed ghost with fiery red eyes. 50 years later, more reports of the village. By this time, with the legend of the Hammersmith Ghost firmly entrenched in village lore, the media decided to camp out, hoping to get a glimpse of the returning specter. And they were rewarded. Newspaper accounts of one ghostly stakeout described how witnesses watched as a glowing apparition in a white flowing dress floated across Black Lion Lane and disappeared into a crypt at the old church cemetery. Back in 1804, there was a man who lived on Black Lion Lane who brewed his own beer. It must have been pretty good because he eventually built a pub at his brewery. And today, the Black Lion pub still stands in that area of southwest London. If you're ever in the area, pop in for a pint, because the bartender will only happily tell you about the haunting history of the Hammersmith ghost attacks. Number 2. Snippy the Horse. Clay Buckles saw it first. It pointed out to his group of 4 friends a UFO that was slowly and silently passing over their heads at about 10:30 p.m. on a cool Colorado night. The next day, Buckles called the Boulder police. The object, he reported, had 3 round shapes that each glowed with a red triangle. The cops took the report seriously, given they were in the flight path of Denver's Lowry Air Force Base. 4 months later, the U.S. Air Force casually announced that it was extending the contract of a special think tank based out of the University of Colorado. The group of researchers had been tasked with collecting reports of unidentified flying objects over the Rocky Mountain State. Because the skies over Colorado in 1967 and 68 were rife with unexplained phenomenon, Recently, a student at nearby Amstead College told police he spotted a strange object in a field. As they drove towards it, his tires mysteriously deflated. When he got out to check them, the object was gone. Later, a construction worker driving his pickup told police he wanted to report being followed by a flying object that was shaped like a toy top. Then there was another close encounter that resulted in tragedy. For Snippy, a 3-year-old saddle horse in Alamosa, Colorado. On the night of September 7th, 1967, rancher Harry King noticed that Snippy hadn't returned home for her nightly watering. But he wasn't too concerned. Snippy sometimes went grazing around the San Luis Valley for a few days at a time. When Snippy failed to show up the next day, he decided to go looking for her. Harry got only a quarter of a mile away when he found Snippy, dead, completely skinned. All that remained of the animal's head and neck were bleached bones. The horse was peeled, writer Sylvia Lobato, a family friend of the Kings, told the Denver Post in 2006. It had only been dead for a night, but it looked like it had been dead for months. Harry later told the Daily Sentinel newspaper the horse's hide had been completely removed from the neck up. However, the cut had been done surgically. It was smooth, he said, not at all jagged. To add to the mystery, there was not a drop of blood on the body or anywhere on the ground around it. But things grew stranger still. When Harry returned to the dead horse the next day, along with a couple of friends, they searched the area for evidence. What they found shocked and confused them further. In one place, there were what they called exhaust marks in the dirt. In another, they found a bush that had been flattened straight down to the ground, 10 inches high. In yet another area, the group found a number of indentations in the soil, indentations that formed a perfect circle in the ground, 75 feet wide. A woman with the group, Nellie Lewis, also said that they found a strange tool that was covered with blood and horsehair. The tool smelled like some kind of medicine, she said, adding that when she picked it up and put it in her bag, doing so made her hands burn until she washed them. Harry and his group contacted the authorities, who weren't the least bit interested in their story. The horse, Sheriff Ben Phillips said over the phone, had probably been struck by lightning. Despite no lightning being recorded in the area recently. One person who did arrive to take a look-see was a forestry official who brought a Geiger counter to measure radiation. The device squawked loudly around Snippy's body, warning them radiation was elevated. Upon reading about the story in the paper, a prominent Denver pathologist volunteered to perform an autopsy on the horse. His findings added to the mystery because he found no organs inside Snippy, despite the fact there was no incision made in her torso. When the doctor sawed into Snippy's skull, he found there was no brain. The horse was definitely not killed by lightning, he said. Standing off to the side of the pathology room were two representatives from the North American Air Defense Command Center in Colorado Springs. They recorded the doctor's findings and confiscated the tool found by Nellie Lewis. 2 days later, the Air Force announced the think tank they funded, the one that looked into UFOs, would officially launch an investigation into Snippy's death. But while researchers at first showed great interest visiting Harry King's ranch and interviewing dozens of citizens around the area, their investigation concluded abruptly. One of the group's spokesmen, Dr. Robert O. Adams, told the newspaper there was nothing strange about Snippy's death after all. The horse, he said, was likely suffering from an infection and was killed by a passerby who took mercy on the animal. Absolutely no one associated with Snippy believed the findings. There were no tracks in the dirt from the so-called Good Samaritan, and the scenario didn't explain the lack of organs, absence of blood, or a strange medicinal smell around the animal. What of the surgical cuts in the animal's carcass as well? Had the surgeon been the Good Samaritan? The Air Force remained mum on the subject of Snippy after that, with her strange demise being filed under weird news and all but forgotten, until 1973, when authorities in Kansas noticed a wave of livestock attacks across the state in which the bodies of farm animals were surgically altered. The following year, the Nebraska Star-Journal reported on farmers who were feeling ill at ease after encountering strange objects in the sky, followed by the discoveries of their dead, mutilated cattle. Which begs the question, was Snippy the first victim of the rash of attacks in the 1970s that gave us the term cattle mutilations? Or was she just a victim of an infection who met her end by a sympathetic, wandering surgeon with a heart of gold? Number 1. The Mad Gasser. It was 3 days before Christmas, 1933, on a farm in Fincastle, Virginia. Cal Huffman, his wife, and their 8 children had just settled down for a long winter's nap when their 20-year-old daughter, Alice, began clattering around their upstairs hallway. She was coughing up something fierce until, as her parents watched in horror, Alice collapsed and stopped breathing. As Cal tended to his daughter, trying to resuscitate her, his wife began coughing as well. And soon their other children emerged from their bedrooms, complaining of headaches. Cal was thankful to be able to revive Alice and went to check on the house. Was it smoke from an unextinguished fire? Had an oil lamp overturned? That's when Cal discovered a strange, sickly sweet odor coming from the main floor. He found a window had been shattered. Officer O.D. Lemon of the Botetourt County Sheriff's Office later determined that an unknown person or persons had somehow and for some reason sprayed an unknown gas into the family's home. Cal Huffman was flummoxed. He had no enemies. Who would want to do this? But it turned out it was impersonal, because over the next month, half a dozen similar gas attacks occurred around Virginia. But as rapidly as they occurred, they ceased altogether. On February 9, 1934, no further gas attacks were reported in the area. Though the phenomenon made headlines at the time, the news apparently hadn't reached further than Virginia. Because a decade later, when gas attacks began happening in Mattoon, Illinois, authorities and residents had never heard of such a thing. On August 31, 1944, a man named Urban Raff woke from a sound sleep, feeling ill. He managed to make it to the bathroom, where he vomited. When he returned to bed, he found his wife was awake, staring at him in abject horror. She was terrified because she told her husband she couldn't move. She was paralyzed. It was then that Urban smelled a strange, sickly sweet odor around the bedroom. Eventually the smell dissipated and his wife was able to move again, but he was spooked enough by the experience to contact the proper authorities. Unfortunately, the cops were too busy to come, because across town they were tending to a strange disturbance involving a young woman named Aileen Kearney. Aileen had gone to bed with a 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy, as per usual. Her husband, Bert, was a night shift cab driver and was at work. About an hour after lights out, Aileen heard her daughter coughing. She got up to get the child a glass of water, but Aileen found out she couldn't move. She too was paralyzed. I began to feel a paralysis of my legs and lower body, Aileen told the newspaper later. I got frightened and scared. Aileen's sister, who had been staying with Aileen, called the police. and the police, in turn, called Bert from out behind the wheel of his taxi. By the time he got home, the police had searched the house, but found nothing suspicious. Elaine and Dorothy seemed to be feeling better, so the cops left after he arrived. Bert also searched the house and reported smelling something sickly sweet, like gardenias, he later said. The husband and father then went to search the perimeter of the house, and that's when he saw someone. An extremely tall man, dressed in tight-fitting black clothes and wearing a shiny black helmet or skull cap. He was also, Bert later said, wearing a long black gas mask over the lower part of his face. Bert called the police back to investigate, but upon their return, they found nothing. 2 days later, Glenda Henderson was at her home with her 11-year-old daughter when they heard someone prowling outside their main floor window. Glenda called the police, but while she was on the phone with them, her daughter began complaining about feeling ill. As the girl vomited, the mother said she began to smell something sweet wafting through their living room. Police and the local newspaper soon grew convinced that the town was being hounded by someone who was purposefully doing this. They dubbed the unknown man as the anesthetic prowler. Soon, more of the 16,000 residents of Mattoon came forward to report that they too had similar experiences in the weeks leading up to the headlines. One Mrs. Ryder noticed a strange smell coming from her children's room and felt lightheaded upon investigating it. But the police were stumped. They had no idea who could be doing this, how, or why. There were similarities in each case, however. The first commonality was that the odor was described as overly sweet, like a sickening, overpowering smell of flowers. The second was the attacks happened primarily at night. And the third, that in none of the cases was there any kind of physical attack, home invasion, or robbery. But the effects of the gas varied. Some of the victims reported feeling physically ill, while others reported a kind of paralysis once exposed to the noxious fumes. Others reported feeling somehow electrified upon inhaling the odor, while still others complained of throat and facial swelling. Mattoon's Mayor E. Richardson launched a full investigation into the gas attacks. He ordered the police to patrol the town day and night. Meanwhile, some media outlets speculated that fumes from a nearby wartime chemical plant were the cause. The chemists from the FBI took air samples from places of reported attacks and compared them to the samples taken from the plant. They were not a match. Then the police got a lead when a woman reported finding a strange white cloth on her porch. When she smelled the cloth, she said, she became lightheaded and found her lips began to swell. Upon further investigation, police found a skeleton key nearby. That's a key that is modified to open multiple locks. By September 8th, there were 13 reported victims, all over Mattoon, who fell victim to the anesthetic prowler. This is one of the strangest cases I have ever encountered in my many years of police work, one state investigator said at the time. Further clues followed. A man, identified as Mr. Daniels, reported that when the night his neighbor, Fred Goebel, was attacked, he noticed a tall, slender, dark figure running away from Fred's house. Another victim found a strange tube of lipstick on her front porch, while another noticed high-heel shoe prints in the garden under his window. Could the attacker be a woman? The attacks had, after all, been described as smelling like, quote, cheap perfume, unquote. But the police didn't think so. In fact, with absolutely no proof of the attacks other than the words of the citizens, and with no further leads to go on, the police started to publicly suggest that the whole thing was a case of mass hysteria. At a press conference, Chief Eugene Cole said hysteria must be blamed for the seemingly accurate accounts of supposed victims. He went on to blame the media for hyping up the idea of the so-called mad gasser at Mattoon. In turn, the citizens blamed the police for shifting the onus on them because of their ineptitude. Our Mattoon Knights took to the streets to perform their own night patrols. Then, 2 days later, there was a bizarre twist. 44-year-old Edna James, the owner of a local motel, said she had her own encounter with a phantom chemist. While lying in bed one night, she was awakened by a strange smell. When she sat up and looked over, she saw someone in her room. He was like an ape, Edna told the newspaper. He stood there, crouched, holding a spray gun. The ape man, she said, shot 3 clouds of gas towards her before running into the night. Perhaps the last report, for the town's only fortune teller no less, was enough for State's Attorney Bill Kidwell. He opted against convening a grand jury in the cases and washed his hands of all of it. And so did the mad gasser at Mattoon, it seems, because there were no more gas attacks after the supposed one on Edna James. And no culprit in Mattoon or in Virginia was ever apprehended or even identified. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. Thanks again for watching.